PhD. So I was thinking actively about that when one of my undergraduate friends, Arthur Rickards, who'd made the transition across the border to at the University of New England at what was then a fledgling farm management service centre, he contacted me from Armidale and said, look, there's this guy who's just joined University of New England as the foundation professor of farm management, John Louis Dillon, he's got a PhD from Iowa State. So why don't you think about maybe coming down here and doing a cheapo Iowa State PhD with one of their leading graduates of recent times? And so I decided I'd think about that pretty actively. So Arthur engineered a meeting for me to come down to Armidale and meet John Dillon, who I'd studied the Hetty and Dillon agricultural production functions book, so I thought I knew him pretty well, but I didn't know what he looked like. So I walked into his office and saw this giant bear of a man who certainly didn't look like an academic. He had a very shortly cropped crew cut. He didn't look anything like any academic I'd ever seen before, and so on my side that looks pretty unpromising. On his side, he looked at me and probably saw a scrawny, cancer-prone Queenslander, and his first question to me was, "Are you a Catholic?" I said, "No. In fact, I'm not even very religious at all." So I was taken back by the question. Turned out John was very keen on building up the Catholic strength in the University of New England at the time. And his second question was, well, do you play cricket? Because he was very keen on strengthening the departmental cricket team. And I said, John, there's one thing I can't stand in life, it's cricket. I had to play it at high school and I hated it. And he said, okay. So there was a bit of some silences in our early debate, and he said, well, actually, I think looking at your academic record, maybe we could do something decent. And he said, I've got some money coming in from the Wool Industry Trust Fund, and I'm going to try to build up the group of graduate students in the department based on those funds. So he said, why don't you apply for this job, which was just being invented at the time? And I duly applied and duly got the job. And so I became a wool industry funded research fellow in the wool economics program of the University of New England in the farm management aspects of that program. So that all happened at the beginning of 1966. So I'd say, looking back on it, there'd been a lot of professional development in the field in Australia before that, through the works of people like Sir John Crawford, or Jack Crawford, we should say, at that stage, Keith Campbell and others. There was a group that I think, looking back on it, turned out to be especially influential in the professional development prior to me jumping into the profession, was the group on agricultural economics and marketing in the New South Wales Department of Agriculture. And as I reflect on this now in this enforced moment of nostalgia, I think, I don't know who is responsible for the fact that the New South Wales government had managed to attract all these hearts and minds of people like Fred Gruen, Ross Parrish, John Dillon, Alan Lloyd, to mention just a few who went on to have chairs in related fields in Australia, and to keep them, or to put them into a really productive research mode, but highly relevant to the practicalities of agricultural development in Australia. So I was an indirect beneficiary of that earlier, I guess, especially during the 50s, development of scholarship in the field, because I was suddenly working with John Dillon, and Ross Parrish also happened to be at the University of New England at the time. So I was, and then along the way, of course, I met some of the other ex-members of that gang, like Fred Gruen and Alan Lloyd and co. And one in particular sticks in my mind was Peter Druce, who was one of the few who didn't go on from the government to academe. But Peter has many fond memories for me. In particular, he was really good friends with one of my contemporary PhD students, one John Quilke. And Quilke and Peter Druce used to share an active interest in wine consumption, and in Peter's case, wine acquisition. Well, since I'm here being interviewed at the International Conference of Economists, I should mention that early in my PhD career at New England, the International Association held a meeting in Sydney in 1967. And for me, that was very helpful in a lot of different ways. In particular, getting my mind away from just what the profession was doing in Australia and the USA via the Iowa State connection, but getting to see the broader picture of what agricultural economists were doing in development work in general. So that was an important part of opening up my otherwise very parochial Queensland historical mind on where the world was heading. It started to get me thinking more about global issues. On the personality side, one, for me, rather memorable feature of that particular meeting was Earl Heady made his, I think, first and last visit to Australia. And so I met the mentor of my mentor, and I had a lot of discussions with John Dillon about this, and we used to joke. He called me, his mentee, and I called him my mentor, and we traced this back to Kenneth Bowling being Heady's mentor, and so we had, I must say, well lubricated discussions about mentorship and the role of all this over the decades and the way it's played out in the profession. And I guess if I really stretched that a bit, I could mention that John Dillon, while he was in his latter days in the States as a PhD student, had the good fortune to have a working breakfast with Ted Schultz, who was by then well established in Chicago after his fiasco at Iowa State. And so I see a little glimmer, and this is overclaiming, I'm sure, but there's a glimmer of Schultzian thinking into my mentorship train. And I don't know how important or that otherwise that may have been. I was lucky enough to meet T.W. Schultz later in life at a World Bank meeting in the 80s at some point, but I can't. I'd like to mention, just for historical purposes, a book that was produced at UNE. It's edited by Sally Bierman, sadly deceased, and that's another story I may get to in this record. But it was celebrating the 25th anniversary of agricultural economics in Armidale, and it's a really nice collection of perspectives on the role that UNE and ag economics at UNE played in the professional development in the wider Australian and even international scene. And a few years back, we discovered that this, apart from never having been widely circulated, was unobtainable and out of print. But along with help from Phil Pardee, that volume is now digitally retrievable from the Ag Econ search at the University of Minnesota. So the Bierman volume is alive and well. I'm not sure if anyone else other than myself has ever downloaded it, but it's there, and if you're into an oral history project, I think it'd be nice to make reference to that volume, since it is now available.